Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the conference. I hope you had a good break. And welcome to this symposium, which I'm really excited about. As you would have seen, that the symposium is called Mental Health in an Uncertain World. And I think it's very timely, and I think there's more attention coming onto the impact of some of the bigger issues that are going on in the world on mental health, and I think that they deserve greater scrutiny in terms of the role they play in early intervention. So I'm looking very forward to this symposium. Just got a few housekeeping notes before we get going. The first thing is to say, make use of the chat function in the platform to put your sort of comments and interact with each other there. Put questions for anything. We're going to have questions and answers at the end, but if you put the questions into the either the chat or preferentially the ask a question button underneath the live stream, put those in as we go along. But we will be coming to all of those after the three presentations. If you are tweeting, please feel free to. That'd be really great. But to remember to use the hashtag IEPA 2021 virtual. And we'll get on with things now. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Arun Nagendra is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Her research focuses on how to promote recovery for Black Americans diagnosed with schizophrenia. Please welcome Arundhati.
Hi everyone, my name is Arundhati Nagendra. I go by Arun, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in clinical psychology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. I'm really excited to talk to you today about my research, which is about how racism shapes risk factors and outcomes for Black people in the US who are diagnosed with psychosis. In this talk, I plan to cover three things. First, why are Black people in the US more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than white people? Second, what are treatment outcomes like for Black people diagnosed with psychosis? And third, given that racism contributes to so many of the observed disparities, what can we do to support Black communities? So, starting in the 1970s, scholars began to observe that Black people in the US were more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than white people, and that conversely, white people were more likely to receive bipolar diagnoses. There are two possible reasons for this. First, Black people could have genuinely higher rates of schizophrenia due to racism-related risk factors. Alternatively, Black people might have the same rates of schizophrenia as white people, but clinicians may be overdiagnosing Black people with schizophrenia. So, why might Black people genuinely be at higher risk for schizophrenia? Well, in the early 2000s, researchers from the Netherlands proposed the social defeat hypothesis, that long-term exclusion from the majority group may be a key environmental risk factor for the development of schizophrenia, and may be the mechanism underlying known risk factors such as immigration and belonging to a sexual minority group. Since then, scholars have argued that Black communities in the US may also experience social defeat, leading to higher rates of schizophrenia. But why are Black people specifically at higher risk of schizophrenia as opposed to other communities of color who may also experience depression and social defeat? To explore this, I want to highlight some research findings that may illuminate the specific types or experiences of social defeat that Black people may go through. First, discrimination broadly and ethno-racial discrimination is associated with the development of psychotic disorders. In Europe, population-based studies have shown that in ethno-racial minority groups, while verbal and other sorts of discrimination are harmful and associated with psychosis, physical attacks in particular seem to be particularly damaging. They increase the odds of psychotic disorders by 2 to 5 times. Second, I want to highlight that Black people may experience a specific type of daily threat and fear. In one study in the US, it was found that when Latino participants with psychosis described their fears of persecution, they would name specific people. But Black people seem to fear persecution from unnamed or unspecific sources. So rather than saying Bob from the store is out to get me, the narrative for Black folks would be more that people are out to get me without being able to say like who or where they were. To me, this unnamed threat is scarier. It's less predictable and less controllable and reflects a more generalized feeling that the world is dangerous. Taken together, these findings suggest that risk factors for schizophrenia may be social exclusion, physical threat, and uncontrollable or unknowable threats. Now, in the US, we don't have longitudinal population-based data to show how racism may predict the onset of psychotic illnesses. We do have some cross-sectional studies that I think show some important associations. In one study, over 5,000 Black Americans were asked if they'd ever experienced a variety of psychotic experiences, like visual or auditory hallucinations. The researchers then looked at the association of these psychotic experiences with different types of lifetime discrimination. Here they are listed. While many of these were associated with psychosis, the strongest association with psychotic experiences was with police abuse, which increased the likelihood of having psychotic experiences by 70%. Now, police abuse in the US, as well as other forms of generalized unpredictable threats, I would argue are a particular type of violence faced by Black people in the US. Between 2014 to 2020, 25% of the people killed by the police in the US were Black, even though they comprise just 13% of the US population. Here are some of the reasons Black people have been killed by cops in the US. Rayshard Brooks fell asleep in his car, blocking a drive-through. Daniel Prude ran onto the street during a mental health crisis. Dante Wright had a minor traffic violation. Manuel Ellis was walking home from a convenience store. George Floyd was allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill. Andre Hill emerged from a garage with a cell phone held up in his hand. I argue that Black people may be at higher risk of for psychosis in the US because racism is a form of social defeat and because they experience specific forms of racism that are associated with psychosis that are different for these reasons listed here under risk factors that are different in magnitude or nature than that experienced by other communities of color in the US. Now, let's talk about the other reason why we might see racial disparities in diagnosis, diagnostic bias. So the diagnostic process involves subjectivity. Diagnoses rely on self-report and the interpersonal interactions between clinicians and clients. Because of historical and ongoing medical abuses in the US, Black people tend to be more mistrustful of medical spaces. Now, researchers have shown that clinicians tend to attribute paranoid and suspicious behavior to Black Americans, even when they're showing similar behaviors to white people. So it may be that normative mistrust is misinterpreted by clinicians as paranoia, leading to higher rates of schizophrenia diagnoses. White interviewers also tend to view Black people as being less honest during diagnostic interviews, and this partially mediates the relationship between race and diagnosis. So you can see how quickly this could become problematic. A Black person may be interacting with a white clinician, being understandably mistrustful, but not actually paranoid, and then be labeled as guarded or suspicious, and then be inaccurately diagnosed as having schizophrenia. Lastly, Black individuals are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and white people are more likely to be diagnosed with a less stigmatized bipolar disorder. One major difference here is the affective or emotional component. There's a body of research showing very clearly that we are all much better at reading emotions in the faces of people who belong to the same ethno-racial group as us. So here we are relying on clinicians who are largely white in the US being able to accurately read cross-cultural ways of expressing emotion, despite research that shows we're all much better at identifying emotions in people of our own race than others. So there's many, many potential sources of diagnostic bias. Even if we were able to address this, there's kind of a deeper underlying issue here. Now, researchers have coined the term cultural mistrust, which refers to a healthy, adaptive mistrust by Black people in the US of other people. We assess it to three questions like, why people are usually fair to all people regardless of race, or why people deliberately pass laws to block the progress of Black people. Despite it being healthy, normative, and adaptive, cultural mistrust is positively correlated with clinical paranoia. I'm going to show you a diagram here and walk you through it. On the x-axis, you have non-pathological mistrust to pathological paranoia. On the y-axis, you have the extent to which feelings of mistrust are culturally influenced, from cultural mistrust to non-cultural mistrust. All right, so on the top left here, we have somebody who, doesn't have any sort of mental illness but is high on cultural paranoia. So they're just experiencing a normative response to racism. So they may say things like, I don't trust cops. Not sick, but understandably mistrustful. On the bottom left is someone with normative, non-cultural mistrust. So for example, I always put a black piece of tape over my laptop webcam because I'm anxious about someone recording me and using that data to hurt me somehow. Mistrustful, but it's also something that is relatively normative. On the right hand, we have what we think of as pathological paranoia. On the bottom right here is somebody who has non-cultural content in their delusional beliefs. So this is what we typically think of when we use the word paranoia. It's something like the FBI is out to get me. On the top right here, we have cultural content in paranoid delusions. So as an example, I worked with a client who believed that the chief psychiatrist on an inpatient unit was a plantation owner and was keeping him on the unit solely for financial gain. It's deeply cultural and metaphorical, but it was also just not true. So my point here is that racism can both be misconstrued by clinicians as paranoia and can also genuinely cause and exacerbate pathological paranoia. And this really muddies the diagnostic process and makes it hard to really accurately diagnose paranoia and suspiciousness in Black folks in the US. So there's evidence to think both that Black people in the US actually have higher rates of schizophrenia than white people, and to think that assessment bias contributes to the inaccurate overdiagnosis of schizophrenia in this group. To explore this issue, in 2018, my colleague Charles Olbert spearheaded a meta-analysis of Black-white diagnostic disparities in schizophrenia in the US. We looked at 52 studies with a sample of over 2 million people. Here are our main findings. First, we found that across all studies, Black people were about 2.4 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than white people. Second, we wanted to see if using structured diagnostic interviews as opposed to unstructured interviews would lessen the magnitude of racial disparities. The answer was yes. This would suggest that misdiagnosis of schizophrenia is a major contributor to racial disparities, rather than that there are actually higher rates of schizophrenia in Black Americans or in Black people in the US. Unfortunately, we found that only 14 of the studies actually used structured diagnoses. Most studies used unstructured methods to diagnose people. So we were actually underpowered to answer this question. But if you look at the odds ratios here, it looks like using structured instruments does lower the size of the racial disparity. Third, we examined moderators of the relationship between race and diagnoses. Of these 5 different listed moderators, we found that samples with a larger proportion of white participants and that samples that were younger tended to have bigger disparities. We did not find that study setting, geographic region, or the year in which the study was conducted made a difference. So what does this tell us? Well, first, that it seems like both assessment bias and racism as a risk factor contribute to Black-white diagnostic disparities in the US. Second, unfortunately, this disparity is not decreasing with time. It is not going away. And third, using culturally informed structured diagnostic methods is crucial, especially in majority white settings and with younger people. I'm going to change tacks a little bit now and talk about racial disparities in outcomes. So As compared to white people, Black people diagnosed with psychosis are also at higher risk for worse outcomes. This includes objective outcomes like higher rates of unemployment and incarceration, but also clinical outcomes. Black people diagnosed with psychosis experience higher rates of psychiatric hospitalizations, as well as potentially worse symptom trajectories and higher rates of suicide. However, at present, most work on racial disparities in psychotic disorders has focused on people with longer histories of illness. This means that it's really hard to disentangle the extent to which disparities are due to culture and racism versus factors related to illness chronicity, like medication history. A focus on early psychosis allows us to get a clearer and cleaner understanding of racial disparities in psychosis and allows us to also determine when disparities emerge and necessitate intervention. So I'm going to present to you some data from a paper under revision looking at treatment outcomes by race in first episode psychosis. Our data comes from the RAISE study, which was a 2-year randomized controlled trial that demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated specialty care, CSC, the gold standard treatment for first episode psychosis. RAISE had a large nationally representative sample in the US. 404 participants across 34 sites were randomized to either treatment as usual in the community, which was determined by clinician choice or service availability, or to coordinated specialty care, or CSC, in which people were provided with gold standard treatment, including personalized medication management, family education, individual therapy, and support in employment and education. RAISE was a landmark study. It was the largest test of a gold standard treatment for early psychosis across the US. And coordinated specialty care improved a whole host of outcomes. After 2 years, as compared to people in treatment as usual, those in coordinated specialty care experienced more improvement in quality of life, overall symptoms, self-reported mental health, employment, and education. But few studies have examined outcomes by race. In a study by Olawoye et al. On racial disparities in the RAISE study, they found that there were differences in patterns of services. So for example, Black families were less likely to come to family psychoeducation than white families. Olawoye et al. Also found that there were Black participants in community care, so in treatment as usual, showed less improvement in positive symptoms than did white or Latino clients. But they did not look at other clinical outcomes, including quality of life, which was the primary outcome in the RAISE study. So in this project, we built on Dr. Olawoye's work and explored clinical treatment outcomes between non-Latino Black and non-Latino white participants in the RAISE study. Our subsample was large, consisting of about 300 participants who were in their early 20s. We were particularly interested in clinically oriented outcomes. So we examined interviewer-rated quality of life, which covers social relationships, employment skills, and independent living skills, as well as symptomatology and self-reported mental health, which included one's general sense of well-being, hopefulness about recovery, and experiences of stigma. We found differences and racial differences in positive, disorganized, and depressed symptoms, as well as stigma. However, for disorganized and depressed symptoms, our findings could actually be explained by baseline differences in symptom severity rather than by longitudinal treatment trajectories. For positive symptoms, what we found is that Black participants showed less improvement than white participants in both CSC and treatment as usual, although this effect was especially pronounced in treatment as usual. So this was consistent with prior research. Additionally, we found significant findings for stigma, which you can see here. To orient you, there are two separate graphs here. On the left is treatment as usual, and on the right is coordinated specialty care. The x-axis on each graph shows the time in months from baseline to 2 years, and the y-axis shows stigma severity. Blue lines are the trajectories of white participants over time, and red lines are the trajectories of Black participants. So what you can see is that in Navigate, for both Black and white participants, stigma went down over time. In treatment as usual, however, stigma went down for white participants, but actually increased for Black participants. So why might Black people improve less on positive symptoms? There we go. Why might Black people improve less on positive symptoms? Well, part of this might be because of the interaction between positive symptoms and cultural mistrust. Black people who experience racism may, over time, also be more prone to experiences of paranoia. Unfortunately, we do not have the data to explore this in our current data set. However, if indeed future studies show that racism does exacerbate positive symptoms, it speaks to the need for culturally tailored treatments to support Black clients experiencing racism. Now, why might stigma get worse for Black people in treatment as usual? Well, Black participants are more likely to experience double jeopardy, which refers to the multiplicative detrimental effects of experiencing discrimination from both racism and from mental health stigma. So, a Black person diagnosed with psychosis may be treated worse by the general public than a white person diagnosed with psychosis. Additionally, because they're far more likely to have experienced discrimination because of their race prior to their diagnosis, Black participants may be more attuned to prejudiced behaviors from other people, like people physically distancing themselves during social interactions. So, in other words, because of racism, Black participants may be more likely both to experience stigmatizing behaviors and to notice them when they occur. However, it is promising that in coordinated specialty care, stigma went down as expected. And this may be because coordinated specialty care directly addresses stigma, like by helping clients challenge their own stigmatizing beliefs, talking about celebrities who have had psychotic disorders and led productive and meaningful lives, and emphasizing resilience. This is important as stigma is associated with a host of negative outcomes, such as unemployment, homelessness, and treatment disengagement, all of which are higher in Black individuals. Beyond stigma, though, it's striking that there were so few racial differences in the treatment outcomes that were measured in the study in first episode psychosis. So why then have other studies shown worse long-term outcomes in people who experience psychosis? Part of this might be because in the long term, Black participants are less likely to engage in treatment than white participants, which may lead to worse long-term treatment trajectories. Alternatively, we do know that racist policies contribute to high rates of unemployment and incarceration for Black people in the general population in the US. So, for Black people diagnosed with psychoses, these disparities may actually be driven by racism rather than illness-related characteristics, which means we have to kind of shift how we're thinking about it. Future directions for this work would include identifying when disparities emerge, and also to explore the role of cultural and racism-related factors, and to really try to ensure that we're addressing what Black communities need in their treatment. More broadly, what can we do? We know that racism may be a primary but underexplored contributor to disparities in the US. Well, first, it's important to understand that racism, not race, causes disparities, and as such, to move from simply describing disparities to understanding how and why they emerge. So in one study we recently published, we found that 62% of schizophrenia-related papers published in major psychiatric journals between 2014 to 2016 mentioned race, but it was mostly treated as a nuisance variable, put in the sample description or statistically adjusted for or accounted for. Only 9% of the papers we looked at conducted primary analyses by race. And of these 9% of papers, none of them actually explained why they were looking at race in the introduction or discussion. They just kind of looked at it. So it's important to really think about this in a nuanced way. Some ideas for how to do this include using geocoding to explore how neighborhoods and context may impact outcomes for Black communities. Which may capture how racist policies impact the context in which people live. So, for example, one study that was recently published found that neighborhood-level residential instability predicted an earlier onset, but did not look closely at Black communities. Another unexplored area is interpersonal racism, and understanding how and when that impacts clinical presentation and outcomes and people's mental health. Second, it's really important to acknowledge within-group variation within communities of color. Not all Black people are the same. It's crucial to explore within-group variation and also do this to challenge the myth that white people are the gold standard to which we need to compare other communities of color. when we're thinking about mental health. Third, none of the measures I mentioned in my talk today have undergone thorough cross-cultural validation, which means that the foundation on which we are resting some of our conclusions here is shaky. So one concrete step in this direction is to use statistical approaches like item response theory, which doesn't require the collection of new data, to identify particularly problematic items and constructs in existing measures. Lastly, we have to do better with diversifying who we work with. 82% of US-based schizophrenia researchers who publish in high-impact journals are white. This white gaze limits diversity of thought, including the nature of questions we ask, how we ask them, and what we conclude. This principle applies whether we are researchers, clinicians, or community stakeholders. It's so important to collaborate with people who have lived experience and with communities of color in order to really challenge existing whitewashed paradigms and to address racial disparities that have persisted for so many decades. So that's the end of my talk. I'm always looking forward to talking to people who are passionate about similar topics, and I would love to talk if you are. Here is my email, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Aaron. That was a really incredible start to this symposium, and I think you've gone through and raised so many thought-provoking points, and I look forward to the discussion we'll have at the end of this symposium. If people have questions for Aaron, or indeed for any of the other presenters as we go, please put them in the Ask a Question section underneath the live stream. And we will be having about 25 minutes at the end for questions and answers and discussion. And I think there'll be a lot of things to discuss. I'd like to move on now to introducing our second presentation, for which we have two speakers. So I'd like to introduce them. The presentation is called The Climate Crisis and Youth Mental Health. And our presenters for this presentation are Sam Galvin, who is a 17-year-old community organiser working in intersectional anti-racist climate activist spaces. Sam lives near high bushfire risk areas and feels the dread of the climate crisis in its many forms. Dedicated to change and justice, he is a supporter of the School Strike for Climate movement and works with Friends of the Earth in the Act on Climate Collective. Along with Sam will be Dr. Reem Ramadan, who is a clinical psychologist and senior clinician at Origin here in Melbourne, where she is involved in clinical research and translation activities. Reem has over 10 years' experience as a practicing clinical psychologist and has particular expertise in the diagnosis and treatment of young people experiencing mental health disorders. Reem is also a passionate advocate for environmental and social justice issues and a dedicated climate activist. So please welcome Sam and Reem.
Hi, I'm Dr. Reem Ramadan, a clinical psychologist, and I've worked at Origin for 9 years. I'm here with Sam to talk about the research and advocacy work that Origin is doing in the area of climate change and youth mental health. I also want to acknowledge and thank Angie Fong, a youth representative on the Origin Climate Action Committee, for her help with this presentation. Sam?
Hey there, my name's Sam Galvin and I use he, him pronouns. I am a senior school student and community organiser with Friends of the Earth's Act on Climate. For the past year, I've been working within youth representation on Origin's Climate Action Committee. Now, before we start this presentation today, I'd like to acknowledge that we are recording this from stolen, unceded Indigenous land. We are both recording this from Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung land of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of this land, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any members of the Indigenous community from many parts of the world who are with us today. I acknowledge the First Nations people always was and always will be the caretakers of the land, river, skies, and seas, and the sacred connection to everything around us is vital to the health of our climate. I'd like to acknowledge that the effects of the climate crisis impact Indigenous people disproportionately, that we cannot have climate justice or mental health justice without First Nations justice. Furthermore, through our work to take action on climate change and mental health, it is vital that we actively decolonize our thinking and actions with everything we do. First Nations justice and decolonization go hand in hand, and none can happen without the other. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Sam and I will talk about the climate crisis and its impact on youth mental health. I will discuss a scoping review conducted by Origin and other research on this topic and the implications of this research. Sam will also share his feelings and experiences in response to the climate crisis and what he wants from youth mental health services. So today we're not here to discuss the climate science in depth, so I'll just make some key points. The 6th assessment report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released in August this year, stated that climate change is unequivocally human-induced. Climate change is having a significant impact on our planet. We're almost at a tipping point if we don't stop global warming. It is also clear that the climate crisis disproportionately affects certain groups more, including young people, Indigenous populations, and marginalised and disadvantaged communities. Food and water shortages are contributing to conflicts and mass migrations right now due to droughts, rising sea levels, air pollution, all of which are all related to greenhouse gas emissions caused by the burning of fossil fuels, industrial farming practices, and deforestation. Climate change is also having a massive destructive effect on biodiversity. As Greta Thunberg, perhaps the most well-known youth climate activist, said at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019, people are suffering, people are dying, and entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are at the beginning of a mass extinction. So the evidence-based climate predictions are dire and very extreme. So what effect is this having on young people's emotional and psychological well-being? To start, there are many terms used to describe climate-related distress. Climate anxiety is just one, which we will use today. Young people are letting us know that they are worried about climate change and demanding action. Recent youth-led movements, notably the school strike for climate protests, which were inspired by Greta Thunberg, have been attended by millions of young people across 150 countries. In an Australian online survey of over 25,000 15 to 19-year-olds, mental health and the environment were rated in the top 4 of their most important issues for the last 2 years. There is also growing momentum for governments to be held accountable for their actions on climate change due to the scientific evidence of the climate impacts and recognition of the special vulnerability of children. Young people have successfully taken legal action against governments in Australia, Canada, the United States, and several other countries for their inaction on reducing greenhouse gas emissions to safe levels. Young people's concerns are also being recognised by health-related professional bodies, including psychiatry and psychology groups, top health journals such as The Lancet, and health organisations across the world, including the World Health Organization. They have all called for urgent action on climate change due to the health consequences and highlighted the impacts on young people and mental health as significant concerns. The significant and wide-ranging impacts of climate change on physical and mental health are now well recognised. Extreme weather events such as heat waves, storms, hurricanes, bushfires, and flooding, and enduring weather changes such as droughts, heat stress, air pollution can have both direct effects on mental health and the indirect effects resulting from factors such as rising sea levels, water shortages. These make the environment potentially uninhabitable, leading to economic loss, displacement and forced migration, collective violence and civil conflict, and alienation from the degraded environment. In addition, the existential threat of climate change can also trigger feelings of despair and hopelessness. So for an example, in the Black Saturday bushfires in Melbourne in February 2009, 173 people tragically lost their lives and more than 1 million wild and domesticated animals died. Research by Melbourne University showed that 1/4 of the people from highly impacted communities reported symptoms consistent with a diagnosable mental health disorder, including PTSD and depression, 3 to 4 years after the bushfires. And 10 years on, they remain twice as likely to have one or more of these conditions when compared to those from low or no impact communities. Researchers also found an indirect effect of the bushfires on mental health. Major life stresses such as a loss of income, accommodation and relationship breakdown in the years following the bushfires were associated with poorer mental health outcomes and were a predictor of persistent or emerging mental health issues over the next 10 years. In another study, Burke and colleagues examined data from multiple decades for both the United States and Mexico and found that rates of suicide increased with increased average monthly temperature. Based on their findings, they calculated future projections that estimated by 2050, climate change will cause more than 21,000 excess suicides in these two countries. Our scoping review focused on the existential threat, not the mental health impacts associated with extreme weather events or enduring weather changes. Although the causal relationship between worry about climate change and a diagnosis of mental illness wasn't directly examined in any of the included papers, available evidence suggests that young people are worried about and experience a range of negative emotions about the threat of current and future effects of climate change. In several of the studies, young people reported concern about climate change, not only in the present, but also in the future. This is consistent with the view of climate anxiety as owing to an existential threat to life itself, and supports the argument that young people are likely to be at higher risk for the detrimental effects of climate-related worry. Positively, our results also revealed evidence for factors that may help to promote well-being among young people in the face of the existential threat of climate change. This was an unexpected finding, as our research question and the search strategy aim to understand the evidence related to mental health and the negative emotions associated with climate anxiety. A number of factors were shown to support well-being or coping, including meaningfulness, hope, and optimism, an awareness of possible solutions, a high degree in trust in environmental organizations, and the motivation to engage in positive environmental behaviors. While the lack of data currently makes it difficult to draw firm conclusions about the mechanisms or long-term mental health impacts of climate anxiety in young people, there is a clear argument for youth being a critical period, both for the emergence and prevention of climate-related mental health problems. In our conceptual framework, negative emotions such as anxiety, concern, worry, or despair, while not pathological by themselves, may increase the risk of mental ill health if they become prolonged and overwhelming. While the evidence for long-term mental health risks associated with climate anxiety is scarce, there is a strong body of research to show that other types of long-term stress increases the risk of mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and substance use problems. In the context of climate change, the risk of emergence of mental ill health may be increased by individual or collective risk factors, including the direct effects of climate change. This risk may be buffered by healthy coping strategies and by protective factors like having a strong connection to culture. The relatively small number of studies that met the inclusion criteria for this review contrasts with the large amount of research found on the direct impact of natural disasters on the mental health of young people, which included nearly 500 peer-reviewed articles to October 2020, when the review was conducted. A supplementary analysis showed that the research in this area was extremely scarce until the mid-1980s. And then in 2005, Hurricane Katrina prompted a spike in publications, and since then, publications per year in this area have been relatively stable. The increase in the number of publications in this area reflects the increasing frequency of natural disasters worldwide and a growing understanding of the direct effect on young people's health and well-being. So our main findings of the present review highlight the need for more research that considers the experiences of young people who have not been directly impacted by a specific climate event, as well as those who have. As the frequency of climate disasters increases, the likelihood that more people will be directly impacted by such events also increases. So understanding how climate anxiety may interact with the stress of experiencing climate events is also a key area for further investigation. Longitudinal research is needed to assess climate change-related negative emotions and the mental health outcomes over time. Such research will offer invaluable data on the potential factors contributing to vulnerability or resilience. Further research with young people across cultures and countries is also a priority, particularly for Indigenous young people who may be particularly vulnerable to negative mental health impacts of climate change. To avoid creating definitions that center the experience of white, wealthy communities, researchers must engage in genuine collaboration with young people with diverse experiences and identities to design research and develop terminology and measures that considers the complexity of climate anxiety as a phenomenon. Results of this scoping review also have implications for youth mental health care. Prevention and intervention initiatives could aim to target coping mechanisms, in particular those shown to support well-being and reduce negative effect, such as meaning-based coping. Given the large numbers of young people reporting worry about climate change, mental health professionals should also ask about climate-related worries as part of their routine clinical assessment to inform their treatment plan. In addition, the mental health system itself needs to be resilient and responsive to the challenges brought by climate change. By developing risk assessment and adaptation plans that respond to climate change and to skill up a climate-aware workforce. Mental health services can play a direct role in climate change mitigation by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions through the adoption of environmentally sustainable practices and infrastructure. The largest survey of climate anxiety in young people was conducted in May 2021. 10,000 young people aged between 16 and 25 years from a diverse set of countries with a range of incomes and differing levels of direct exposure to severe effects of climate change were asked about their thoughts and feelings about climate change and the government response. It was found that the psychological burdens of climate change are profoundly affecting the huge numbers of young people. This is also the first study to offer insight into how young people's perceptions of government's responses to climate change is associated with climate anxiety. Distress about climate change was associated with young people perceiving that they have no future, that humanity is doomed, and that governments are failing to respond adequately, and with feelings of betrayal and abandonment by governments and adults. These are chronic stresses which will have significant and long-lasting and incremental negative implications on the mental health of children and young people. So what are the implications of the current research on our work? To start, we have to be honest with ourselves that when it comes to the climate crisis, we've gone well past the stage of prevention and early intervention. The risk now is that we leave it too late and all that we can do is provide a palliative response. But there is still time. The recent IPCC report states that we can limit the devastating impacts of climate change. And the climate scientists have known for decades how to tackle the climate crisis. The technology we need already exists. So the problem we face is not how do we mitigate the effects of climate change. The problem is that our response so far has been inadequate. What we need is urgent action on a global level. Policy and action on climate change will threaten the mental well-being and lives of individuals and communities. The cost of inaction is also disproportionately greater for those who are most affected by climate change. Therefore, climate change mitigation is essential for the climate and intergenerational justice, as well as for the prevention of mental health consequences. There is urgent need for increases in both research and government responsiveness to protect the mental health of young people by engaging in ethical, collective, policy-based action against climate change. Thus, arguably, the most important role we, mental health leaders and service providers, can play is to show leadership in advocating for climate change action consistent with the concerns of young people. The positive effects of strong government action to address major health issues, from tobacco reform to seatbelts, are well known. And right now, we are currently witnessing the importance and necessity of government leadership and policy in managing the COVID-19 pandemic across the world. It is therefore undeniable that sufficient and coordinated government action can result in rapid systemic reforms and innovations and lead to significant changes in individual behavior. This is exactly what we need to tackle the climate crisis. What can we do to build a climate-aware and responsive mental health system? Well, we must support and promote the efforts of young people, particularly those who are disproportionately affected, to seek action on addressing climate change from the broader community, industry, and crucially, our government. But even more than that, we must take action ourselves as organisations that seek to improve the mental health and well-being of young people now and into the future. Climate change considerations must be integrated into all aspects of our work from now on. The Origin Climate Action Committee was established in October 2019 and consists of volunteers from our staff, including members of the Origin Executive, and 2 inspiring youth representatives, Angie and Sam. We have 5 focus areas. So far, we focus mainly on our advocacy strategy by developing a statement of commitment on climate change, which has been improved by our exec, and we will continue to take a leading role in advocating in this area. In addition, we've completed the scope and review I discussed earlier, and we will continue to focus on this important research area. We're also planning to design and implement strategies to minimize our carbon footprint, to design policies, templates, and other resources which integrate climate considerations into decision-making across our organization, and to work with young people to share their stories and experiences about climate change. So we have a duty of care to young people to address the climate crisis. And the evidence is unequivocal. We are on a tipping point and we must act now. Now, more than ever, we must join together in our communities to do all that we can. Start local, working with your own teams, organizations, to become climate aware and responsive. We all can have a real tangible impact on addressing climate change and so improve the overall well-being of young people, each other, and our planet. Over to you, Sam.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to share an experience. I'm 17 years old, and quite frankly, I'm terrified for the future. Growing up, knowing that we are hurtling to a point of no return, where there very well may be no future for us. Watching the power players of the world twiddle their thumbs and watch the world burn because, quite frankly, they caused this, because this benefits them. The level of stress, anxiety, and depression that this causes, not just for myself, but for my loved ones and everyone else on this world who are being affected and will be affected, is almost indescribable. Waking up every day knowing at the current rate we are simply surviving on borrowed time. And then looking out there and seeing how bad it is for people who have less privilege than I do. All this fear, all this worry, I've seen what it does unchecked, without support. I've seen it happen within myself and how it affects every aspect of my life, from self-worth issues to days-long anxiety attacks. I have questioned countless times if the future is one worth living in. And then when I have turned for help from the health professionals who are supposed to support me, I've been shut down, told that there's nothing to worry about, that I'm overreacting, that it's all fine. It's not fine. And I know other people who have had similar experiences to me. I think we need health professionals to be climate aware, and this means they must have adequate training to support others in their climate-related distress. There must be proper education and resources and support so they can support us, because without it, they will do more harm than good. Without it, we are leaving our most vulnerable and in need of support behind. Now, I was privileged enough to be able to access that support, to better understand my emotions and help channel my grief and anger and pain into action. And I know it will take a lifetime's journey to be able to learn to live with the effects and adapt to the climate crisis. But not everyone has that privilege of being able to just simply live with those effects when they are on the front lines. Because adaptation without mitigation of the effects of the climate crisis will predominantly benefit the privileged and leave those most vulnerable, those on the front lines, marginalized communities, it will leave them behind. And that is not climate justice. That is not First Nations justice. That is not mental health justice. So I call on the entire health community. Now is the time for action. You can spend all the time you like researching the potential long-term effects, but the reality is that young people are feeling these effects now. We're suffering now. We need your help, not just on a health level, but on an advocacy one too. When the world is in crisis, we turn to health professionals like yourselves who have dedicated lifetimes to supporting communities. So use that, influence, change, support those who are most vulnerable, those who are marginalized, refugees, Indigenous communities, those on the front lines. Have the courage to take a stand. You cannot be neutral in this fight against the climate crisis. We get one shot at this. And I ask, not only in the name of my own future, but the future of the 7.8 billion people on this planet and the very health of our ecosystem itself. The best form of early intervention and prevention on climate-related mental health issues is to act on the climate crisis itself. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Reem and Sam, both for the content of what you've presented us today with, but also the passion with which it's presented and the urgency of the call to action about what we need to be doing in many aspects of our practice and our advocacy as well. As I said before, if you have questions, please put them in either the chat or the question space. We'll be having the question and answer session at the end of the three presentations. I'd like to move on now to introduce our last speaker, who is going to talk about factors influencing the mental health and psychological well-being of refugee children. And that is Dr. Alistair Agar. Dr. Alistair Agar holds academic appointments as Director of the Institute of Global Health and Development at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh and is Professor with the Department of Population and Family Health at Columbia University. From 2017 to 2020, he served as the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK Department for International Development. So please join with me in welcoming Alistair.
It's a great pleasure for me today to contribute to this symposium on early intervention, mental health in a changing world, with a particular focus on the experience of the psychosocial well-being of refugee children. And as you can see from my title, I'll be adopting what I'm going to call a multi-level bioecological framework for a review, reporting on a scoping review that I conducted with Stella Arakelian, a colleague at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, late last year, appearing in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. And talking on that review today provides me with a great opportunity to reflect back over 25, maybe 30 years of history in this field and what we're learning as factors that predict outcomes for refugee children and therefore guides policy and practice in this area. And that date, that timing of 25 to 30 years is for myself marked by my first foray into this area, doing a review which provides for me, if you like, a baseline and reflection point, which I'm going to anchor my presentation in. So this is the first presentation. This is the framework that I'll be using and I'll be talking to later on, which is this biopsychosocial framework, very much based upon later work of Bronfenbrenner. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the history that my own work took over the years. And so I'll be looking at time from this period. Back in 1993, the research for it actually was done back in 1991, 1992, regarding the experiences of refugee children, which informed this volume by Robert Desjardins and colleagues, World Mental Health, out of a project at Harvard in the early 1990s. And it's really instructive for me to look back at that review 25, 30 years now later, to see not only the evidence base, but the framing of that evidence base and how that has informed work in the field, subsequently, and how that evolving framework has come. And in that report, one of the framings that I use, which you'll see recurrent and resounding in subsequent work, is this timeline framing of the refugee experience. And essentially, it's an understanding that for refugee children, and for all refugees, in fact, we might distinguish between 4 phases of that experience. There was a very strong understanding early on that the experiences pre-flight, the circumstances that have led to the decision to flee, the act of forced migration, that enforcement of movement, had significant impact on children, indeed adults' well-being, whether that's economic hardship or social disruption or political oppression and violence. Clearly that experience in the pre-flight stage is likely to affect, and indeed does affect, subsequent adjustment. And there was significant attention in the early days to that pre-flight experience, and also to the next stage, which was the experience of flight itself. That flight often bringing separation from family members, a significant loss of assets, as well as loss of relationships, and notwithstanding also a very hazardous passage and experience of movement. The third phase of the experience would then be what we might see as asylum or temporary settlement. I don't have time to go into the huge variety of trajectories of forced displacement, some of which is simply across a national border, from one locality to another, often that international boundary, or quite often that international boundary having rather dubious cultural significance, but having a political settlement within the last 100 years or more that makes that a national boundary. And still the vast majority of refugees are displaced over a single boundary and find their homes temporarily, and as we hear in a moment, often over a long period of time in that circumstance. And although we might be more sensitive in Western settings to longer term settlement and movement from one part of the world to another, by far the majority of forced migration is just from one national boundary to the other, that temporary period of settlement, often in a refugee camp, living with significant uncertainty, and nearly always with very restricted incomes and employment. So the literature back in the early 90s and still today is perhaps strongest for the relative minority of refugee families, including children, the children of those families who are seeking asylum in a Western or a Northern context. And that is insightful in terms of their experience. But we also want to be mindful of the temporary settlement that many children experience just in neighboring context from their country of origin. And then within this frame, 4-phase frame, there was then a sense of settlement, of either a long-term permanent settlement at the end of this journey or experience as a refugee to settle into a new home and a new context, or potentially to return to one's original home. And again, I don't have time to go into the significant complexities of those alternative endings to the refugee experience and narrative, only to comment that opportunities for third country resettlement, a settlement particularly in the global north or the global west, is increasingly restricted. And although again we're mindful of a significant literature, it's really the vast minority of refugees that are in that circumstance. and actually the rarity now of repatriation and return to one's home country. The most common circumstance for many is a protracted displacement, often for many years, indeed decades, really extending that notion of temporary settlement to longer-term settlement. So anyway, in our framing of children's adjustment, there was that understanding of experience over time. There was a complementary framing to that, to recognize that at each of those phases, there were what we might call stressors impacting on children, leading to strain, the term for stress, the experienced embodied stress, emotional distress of the situation. But in the early 90s, very much the framing of work in this area was around the balance of protective factors and coping resources in dealing with or moderating the impact of those stresses and the amount of strain that a child, for example, would show in terms of protective factors related to their family circumstances, economic circumstances, and coping resources that they or their family might have. And that 1992-93 review that appeared in 1995 in the Dijale book was very much sequenced, not only in terms of those 4 phases of the refugee experience and the impact for children, but also on weighing what we understood to be protective factors and coping resources that would serve to protect children. That was critiqued quite early in the 90s, and certainly as the 90s went on, and reflected in this image here from work that I conducted with Marianne Lochry and Fred Ahern, to try to create a more constructivist understanding rather than that rather linear model of progression and over time, and that almost linear understanding of the accretion of protective factors, ameliorating risks and stresses, and coping resources ameliorating them. There was the sense that a child was making sense of the world during this case. It wasn't just a scales between risks and protective factors. There was something very active in the child, potentially in developing their understanding of the world. This is a more Piagetian conceptual understanding. And so the experience world of the child, their interaction with the world led to their development of their own understanding. And this diagram tried to capture the processes that were part of that negotiation, part of that assimilation of knowledge, that accommodation of understanding, to use Piagetian terms, to recognize that on the right-hand side, first of all, this required the child to be active in the world. This isn't a passive process. Children are active in this process. But the way that they experienced the world was the direct personal experience, exposure to challenge and aggression and negative events. But also it was mediated through the family and through parenting and broader family relationships. But it was also mediated through broader social experience. And we're beginning to see a layering of the influences of children, of the experience of children, that becomes a dominant feature in the literature for much of the last 20 years. This is another image that reflected in my work more in the 2000s. I just wanted to note this. This is looking at children and adults to understand that process of integration, that if we're thinking of children on the move, children moving from one setting to another, there's a sense of settlement, there's a sense of trajectory into that new environment. And this was one attempt to think of the range of factors that would support that process of integration over time. And in the middle of this model, you can see that role of social connection, social bridges, social bonds, social links. And there was a lot of study, building on the work of John Berry and others, of the value of linkage with your co-ethnic community, your broader family, your kin, if you like. But in terms of settling into a new environment, the value of making bridges into other communities and the resources that are available to them, and also the links to other societies that you might connect with. So I want to continue going through a few more conceptual framings of the data in this intervening 25 years since that first review, before I then come to a summary of the evidence that I see as contemporarily shaping our understanding. This is another conceptualization built in the early 2000s through work that ultimately came on the next slide to underpin some of the ISC principles for psychosocial support for refugee children and others in context of emergency. And this was reflecting again that human capacity, mental health, skills, knowledge were really important in shaping the experience of children and others. But the social ecology, those social links, the social networks were vital to their adjustment. And these weren't just valence of a connection, but they brought with them culture and values and broader resources. And the other aspect of this framing that was significant was that these domains or pools of resources don't just lie there inert, but in terms of the trajectory of a child's development within the household, within the community, they're very actively engaged with each other. One is drawing resources from one area, investing, acquiring in another, and so forth. And this is trying to reflect this sort of pattern of a building up of resources. The linkages bring assets of cultures and values, connects to new human capacity. And this dynamic framing is showing something about change over time for refugee children, not just a static process, not just an accretion of resources, but an active searching for them that we see echoed later in the work of Michael Unger and others. This is the ISC framework that I mentioned earlier on, which may be familiar to many people, but is really the, particularly in humanitarian settings, the preeminent understanding of the way that the needs of children and others may be seen as nested in terms of some children with acute mental health issues requiring some form of specialist mental health support, which is right at the top of this pyramid. But in lower levels of the pyramid, there's the sense of the routines and the rhythms of communities and ordinary life supporting psychosocial well-being. And therefore, then the first response to refugee children is not direct into therapeutic, more individual interactions, but is to understand that for the vast majority of children, it's in these basic social considerations, the community and family support to the bottom of the pyramid, that is undergirding psychosocial well-being over time. My own work in this period, then in the late 2010, between 2010 and 2015, rather than just looking at risks and predictors of children's well-being, increasingly became involved in looking at interventions. And this is some young women who were involved in a Child Fund international intervention. They had been abducted during the military conflict in Sierra Leone, and in the period of that time, pulled away from their homes, and after many years, then subsequently able to return and reintegrate, would be the hope, as migrants, as refugees, back into their home communities. And the work that we were engaged in was looking at the effectiveness of interventions to support that mental health and well-being of integration. And this is one of the figures that dates from that study. And I found it incredibly useful one, where if you just, this is months to achieve a certain degree of integration measured by certain markers of social integration. And you see the intervention group, and it's a lot of months over time. So it's a number of years, gradually became more and more integrated. So the intervention was successful, or looks to be successful, in terms of driving that integration or supporting that integration. But if we look at a comparison group that didn't receive that intervention, we see in some ways that was even accelerated, and long-term outcomes weren't quite as favorable. But there are other processes happening without interventions that are supporting the gradual return, integration, and well-being of refugee children, displaced children in this particular instance. And this idea of what happens over time when there's no intervention has become a significant interest of mine. And it was also reflected in some of our understandings of looking at child-friendly spaces. That's work that's summarized in these two pictures here. An intervention looking at refugee children. These are children displaced from DRC into Uganda, an attempt to provide some structured play activities to support their integration and well-being over time. And in the data that flows from that study, we looked at children who had attended and children who had not attended these child-friendly spaces. And we see baseline, end line at the end of the project, and follow-up some months later. And the key the two things to draw from this figure is that generally attending a CFS, a child-friendly space, did support children's mental health and well-being. The middle figures for attenders are generally a little higher, the average is a little higher than for non-attenders. It's not a huge impact, but there is a statistically significant impact there. But the second thing to note is that when you go back a year or so later, then the range of scores is enormous. And some children, both attenders and non-attenders, have gone on to do really, really well, have very, very high, development asset scores, to their development progressing very well. But some are doing really poorly. And the biggest range is within those who are non-attenders. So some kids are doing really well, but some kids have not managed to attach to resources within the camp at all and are really struggling. And so intervention can have an impact. Broader processes within communities can have impact. But we need to understand the broader process by which children are caught up within those resources, and particularly those vulnerable children that don't manage to engage either with family or broader intervention resources, potentially undermining their long-term adjustment. So that's a really quick overview of some different framings of refugee experience in children. And now I want to come to this most recent review and just really conclude with trying to unpack a little bit this figure. And I encourage you to look at the paper that Stella and I put together, which reviews over 65 studies in this area that's relevant to it. But this is using Bronfenbrenner's analysis, his PPCT model, which is a more advanced model than is often summarized. And I just want to point to some of the elements of this diagram that I think echo some of the key features of that earlier framing, which for me then provides a very strong understanding, a strong framing. So first of all, we see at the top of the figure that there is time, phases of displacement is reflected here. And Bronfenbrenner recognizes two aspects of time, both a historical time, events over time, very much within the refugee experience, but also recognizing that the developmental age of children at that particular time has a significant impact on the influence of those factors. And so understanding time and its development and the processes of it are crucial to Bronfenbrenner. If we look at the evidence base, there's the impact both of developmental age, broadly, younger children having a degree of plasticity that sometimes adolescents have particular challenges in modeling, and the adjustments of adolescents being particularly difficult, and often interventions being less effective for adolescents. But also the impact of whether we're talking about acute crisis or whether we're talking about longer term settlement. And the broad evidence continues to point to the fact that although acute traumas, acute stressors during the time of flight and early resettlement are significant on psychological well-being, the long-term stresses of fitting in with a new culture, with a new society, with a new community remain significant in the overall balance of things. Both are really important, and we shouldn't be seduced by the drama of some of the more dramatic stresses and looking at the ones of long-term adjustment and well-being within communities. The other thing I want just to point to this figure is anyone who studied Bronfenbrenner is familiar with these sort of ecological rings, and clearly there are issues around the resources within the family, resources within the wider community, and resources within wider institution that are shaping policies and practices that might support refugee settlement, might support the practice in a refugee camp, asylum seeking application process listed there. So we have these familiar layers, but what is really important about Bronfenbrenner's framing is the arrows that link those layers. We tend to think of it, it's a multi-layered model, but often our analyses just stick at one layer as if the layers don't interact. And clearly, social policies and institutions about refugees shape the way a community responds as a host community to refugees. That shapes the experience of families and parents, that shapes the experience of the child. So we don't just want to understand these as different layers. we must understand them as interacting layers, supporting or eroding the capacities and resources at each one. The other factor I want to really draw attention to, which I mentioned earlier on, is that although we naturally think about institutions, structural policies, what community interventions we could put in place, what family support mechanisms we can engage with, child agency is at the center of this model. The child is at the center of the model. There is the sense that supporting activity of the child in the world is crucial. And whilst that won't be, in most circumstances, an individual one-to-one process, it's understanding that these broader layers ultimately have an impact on a child's ability to make sense of their world and to be active in the world. In Unger's words, that I'll just mention in a moment in conclusion, about navigating to resources and negotiating for their access, a really important insight that agency is crucial to this picture. So the evidence supports all of these layers having an influence on children, these layers being interactive with each other. But this, what Bronfman would call proximal processes, the ones between the child and the family, are absolutely crucial. And in my own work, I have to say that I see that for a number of years, so concerned to have impact at the population level, my focus drifted at higher institutional policy factors and community factors, and they're really important. But I lost sight of perhaps the real importance of those interventions penetrating the household, the relationship between parent and child, which is crucial, and all the evidence points to being crucial for longer term outcomes. So in conclusion, there are three main principles I'd want to draw from this analysis. That interaction of one systemic level to influence other levels, and not having a siloed approach, but one that anticipates that connection over time. The crucial role of these proximal processes, the processes linking child and parents and other caregivers, and therefore the central relevance of parenting interventions within this field. And then finally, using that Unger quote that I just noted a moment or two ago, the centrality of child agency and resilience in our understanding of promoting well-being for children. And that's no better emphasized, I think, with that idea of that quote there, to navigate to the resources necessary to sustain positive functioning, as well as the capacity to negotiate for resources to be provided. And I commend the literature to you, that review to you, and I hope this supports the broader discussion within our symposium. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Alistair, for bringing the symposium to the conclusion of the presentations. And I really liked the sort of way that, in my thinking, you sort of really highlighted the need to think about across the different levels that people are at. And I think sometimes there's a tendency, particularly a naive tendency, to look at the one worst issue for people and not recognise them as part of a whole system, which might also provide a lot more support. So we've got time for questions now. And again, I'd encourage people in the audience to add your questions either in the chat or the ask a question button. But what I'd like to start as a sort of a way to get started in terms of the question, Aaron, is with you. And it was funny because during your presentation, this occurred to me, but then you brought it up at the end, and I think you said there's something like 82% of the researchers who are publishing about this are white researchers, and you commented about the white gaze that comes with that. And I just wonder if you've got some, would like to expand on that a little more, and maybe even discuss, that whole thing about who constructs knowledge. And I think it's something that's not just present around racism, but in many, many other areas that maybe cover the other topics as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I heard this term, the white gaze, just honestly a few months ago. I think it's been around a lot longer than that, but it resonated so much with me. And it's something that I think, like, even though I'm brown, like, I've been trained under that. And the way I think about that is it shapes the questions that we ask, the methods that we choose to answer our research questions, and how we interpret our findings. And I've thought about this a lot in terms of recovery, which is what a lot of my interests are in, and how we kind of, I think, like, one of the most potent examples of like the white gaze in my research is when we think about predictors of recovery. So when we think about, like, how do we intervene to support people with early psychosis or even people with longer histories of illness, we focus primarily on individual factors and family factors. So a lot of research is focused on things like neurocognition, social cognition, independent living skills, employment skills, et cetera. But there are studies that show that these kind of individual level factors actually have limited predictability in explaining the worst outcomes we see in Black communities. And so, you know, like the white gaze is a very individualistic one. And so perhaps it would make more of a difference if we could take the focus off individuals and put it more heavily on communities and context, kind of like what Alistair was talking about, and think about how that might impact outcomes in various ways. So for example, in the US, by design, it's a deliberate choice, tobacco and alcohol outlets are disproportionately concentrated in communities of color. So how might this impact substance use outcomes in people with early psychosis? Or how might segregation impact recovery? The idea for me is, like, if we posit that, like, racism, not race, causes disparities, then it would follow that we need to place a stronger emphasis on community than we're currently doing. And I think, and as I said, I think one of the most, like, powerful ways in which the white gaze has influenced research is this really individualistic focus. And I think beyond that, the way we even define recovery and think about, like, what it means to live, like, a meaningful life is also defined by the white gaze. You know, there are some aspects of recovery that are probably undoubtedly universal, like the desire for social connection or to be part of society, but the shape and form of that might really look different across cultures. But so much of our ideas of, like, what functional recovery means and things like that have been defined largely by white communities, despite studies in other countries that show, you know, communities of color tend to focus a little more on things like spirituality and collectivism and communal ties. We're missing a lot of that in our kind of schema of what these really important outcomes in psychosis mean. And so I've also thought some about, like, how do we start tackling this problem? And obviously part of it is, like, diversifying the pipeline of researchers and communicating more with or collaborating more with communities. Another way, I think, is just doing much more qualitative research and not assuming that, like, these constructs that we kind of think of as really stable and as being, like, very core to how we think about recovery or other things have to be the way they are, and starting to do more kind of qualitative work, which again, I think, like, there is more of an emphasis placed with the white gaze on, like, the value of empiricism and quantitative data than there is on these kind of qualitative narratives. And so I think there are a lot of different ways in which it's shaped how we kind of think about mental health that I'm hopeful will change in the near future.
Thank you. Pardon me, Reem. And we should also mention that Sam is not here today, not because he wouldn't want to be here, I'm sure, but he has one of those things that young people have. He's actually got his exams on at the moment, and I think it's probably a much more important place for him to be. But Reem, thinking about the climate, and I guess maybe before I get into it, I'm completely struck by how intertwined all three of these issues that we've heard about today are. I suppose, you know, I really very clearly heard Sam's call to action for clinicians, but I'm just wondering, what kind of advice would you give to clinicians about what they can do? I think one of the things that I think inhibits people often, say, from asking questions or stuff, is that they actually don't know what to do. Is there some advice that you could have?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first bit of advice is to explore and ask about it, because I know as a clinician, that's not something we really question about, but it's so prevalent now and so publicized, particularly at the moment with COP26, and it's everywhere in the media. And so I think asking about how young people feel about these things is a good start, because we know that a lot of young people, they won't necessarily tell you things unless you ask them about it, because they're not sure what things you want to know about. And making that more of a something that we do explore with young people, and how it affects them and in what way it affects them. A bit like Arun was saying, thinking about what it's like for them as an individual. I think the other, and their community and their society, rather than assuming it's going to be any particular way. I think the other thing to recognize is that distress about an actual threat is actually quite normal. And it is quite distressing and worrying. So it's not about pathologizing the issues. It's about actually recognizing and supporting people and helping them deal with their understandable distress. And, again, we know that a lot of young people are quite disappointed with what happened in Glasgow in COP26, and talking to them about that and letting them talk about it and helping them think about how to manage that understandable distress. I think we are talking about mental health, but what a lot of the studies showed was that there's a lot of worry and concern, but there are ways for young people to manage that in quite healthy ways through taking action, through connecting with others, through feeling able to kind of do something about it. And again, as clinicians, I would say, and I think it's really important, I'm a clinician as well, to kind of also start connecting with the communities that you and other clinicians and other organizations that we work in, to actually making this more of an issue. It's something that I think health services have kind of acknowledge as a problem, but don't necessarily see it as our role. But, over the last few years, particularly, we've been connecting the fact that the climate crisis is a health emergency, and it will be increasingly challenging for us in terms of the increased prevalence of mental health distress and health problems all over. So if we start, making sure that this becomes a bigger issue in our services and things, I think that's a really important factor. And that allows young people to see that we also care about this. So it's about what we're doing, not just about what we're focusing in our individual work, but actually we want to support us communities and we want to support young people's futures. So I think they're the main things.
Yeah, great. And I suppose one of the things that, is probably, well, it's already happening, but it's going to happen more because of climate change, I suspect, is a greater number of displaced people and refugees. And Alistair, I was kind of thinking while I was listening to you, and particularly when you got to those sort of slides about the sort of impact of interventions and that, and I'm sort of, thinking about, the pyramid you had with the mental health specialist stuff is all but it's a tiny resource, and I suspect in a lot of the places where people are living, it's a very tiny resource, and most of it has to be down the bottom. So I'm just wondering about the kind of interventions that are generated, sort of organically up, and what your experience of the way that they come to be and how they're implemented in communities is.
Thanks. I guess in answering that, I was struck by both the divergence of the three presentations, but also some sort of similarities, as you were hinting at. And I suppose I could answer in two ways. I could point to some very specific local interventions with a capital I, if you like, which is a package of resources with some often external agent contracted in to provide this service for a fixed period of time. And I think we've got evidence that in addressing the needs of forced migrants, those can have some small impact. They can edge things forward. But all the data points to what the other two presentations also point out about broader social change, the broader influences really being the dominant force. And for me, that's not sort of a defeatism that intervention has no place because there are these larger tectonic plates shaping the experience of children, but rather that our interventions need to leverage and nudge those tectonic plates, if you like, and issues around social change and just to pick up the thing around advocacy for climate change, advocacy for refugee rights, changing the atmosphere, not just at a national level, but at a local level in terms of reception. That activism at a local level being able to have some transformative impact on the broader social culture and reception that migrants will receive. So for me, the key message I was keen to do, and it fits in with some of the things that Aaron was saying, it's partly thinking about those broader issues, the policy, the institutional policies, broader national policies, community factors, but not to point out to that's where the real action's happening and individual and families don't matter, but rather that there's a really complex change of interactions. And again, it was great to have a young advocate in the session, very much modeling the importance of child agency. And so it's a balance between not this romantic sense that children's agency will compete against all those broader structural factors, but we don't want to be defeatist and see that all of the action is in broader social change and the individual child or the individual community has no power. So I think it's, in answering your question about what are effective interventions, it's those which recognize the barriers at community level and national level, in the case I was talking about regarding refugee reception and integration, but doesn't do so in a passive, purely deterministic way, but also recognizes the role of agency of individuals within those social spaces to be able to shape the space for dialogue and the space for action and the space for development. So brokering those two elements together rather than seeing them as two poles that we have to opt for one or the other.
Yeah, and this is probably, I mean, jumping off of that, just thinking about, obviously we're a community of researchers largely in IEPA, clinicians as well, but in either of the three areas that you talked about, what do you see as something concrete we could be doing in terms of the research agenda, particularly around early intervention in mental health in the next little while? And I'm happy for whoever wants to start. Maybe we'll go in the same order again.
Go on, Aaron.
Oh boy. So in terms of, so are you asking what are the sorts of things we need to do to kind of bring the community into doing some of the work?
Yeah, or I mean, I'm very open on what the answer to this is, but just a broad, really, in terms of in all of these areas, and there's many other areas we could have actually, had a whole conference about these kind of issues, these uncertainties that people are facing. And we haven't, I don't think, well considered them in early intervention in mental health, either in the practice we have or the research that we do. So really, what can we change in our behaviour as researchers, or what could funding bodies change in their behaviour as well, to really help us to address the concerns of the people who are experiencing these things, whether it's racism, displacement, climate, precariousness in employment, those sorts of things.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I think one of the really important kind of things to do is, I think people have alluded to this already, is to really leave our ivory towers and connect with communities. And to kind of frame our research in that way. One of the things I've noticed is that, and people talk about doing community-based research or really investing in stakeholders. I think this has proven often to be a much more challenging experience for everyone involved than it may look like on paper. And I think it's something that is like so crucial to actually like making a difference in the communities. With Black communities in the US, I think, for example, there is some movement towards providing treatment and collaborating with treatment in churches or collaborating with pastors, which is something that like really hasn't been done much in the past. I think partly due to the bias of academia tending to be like non-religious and be more agnostic or atheistic and like not attending to like spirituality and religiosity and things like that. And so I think this idea of delivering treatments in communities and really using people who are influential in communities would go a long way in reaching communities of color.
I mean, I think for me, being the non-researcher in the group, I guess I would say that, you know, getting researchers to start actually actively thinking about how climate impacts on young people as part of early intervention. I mean, we have a real opportunity here that if we can address climate change, then this won't be an issue. This is a thing that we can actually tackle. But I'm not sure that we have been. We were really surprised as a research group with my colleagues who did the review paper, how few papers have been done even looking at this. So, you know, a couple more have come out this year since the review ended. But I think the thing is, it's very loud and clear that young people are distressed about this and that the mental health problems could then become a problem in the future. So yes, by connecting with communities, by putting it on the agenda, and also I think by a bit like Arun was saying, involving young people and involving those communities in the research ideas, questions, and how then they can be best supported, because I'm most thinking about what we can do in clinical practice. So one thing we've been really doing in Origin is making sure that young people are involved in this process, and obviously Sam and Angie, who I mentioned, because they have really shaped our thinking and they have really helped us think about what we want to continue doing. So yeah, I think that idea of having it on the agenda and using young people to think about that, they're very articulate and they're very passionate about this issue and they can really be involved. And they're also very passionate about supporting other communities. And I think that really links in with what Alistair and Arun was saying, is that it's the most marginalised groups that are going to be the most affected. And so we really need to be thinking about how we evaluate them and not use that white gaze on that, which, you know, I really like that concept. And I think that's something I'm going to take with me.
I want to pick up on one thing that Arun said and one thing that Reem said. I think sort of two thoughts in terms of the research agenda. One is, I think there has been a danger of people having a favourite variable or a favourite level of their analysis, whether it's community structures or whether it's the individual or whether it's the family or whether it's wider society and policy. And I think all the evidence points to the interlocking of those, and it really doesn't serve us well just to do neat research that is hermetically sealed from that other dialogue. And I think there's a welcome move towards interdisciplinary research, multi-level research that really sees these things as interacting. And I think that's really important. And then I completely endorse the community engagement closer to communities work. But I said I'd like to push it a little bit further, if you like. And most people will be familiar with this sort of emic etic distinction and the sort of the value of emic work really reflecting and honouring the understanding of a local population is hugely important. But I think there's then an opportunity to infect the etic, to go from the emic, to go from these broader understandings. And perhaps, Aaron, I could pick up on your example of engaging with faith communities or broader understandings of spirituality. That's not only an opportunity to do that within communities, but to realize the insights from such work and bring it back into global debate and to challenge the existing Western framing or current framings. And we only do that if we have a commitment to not just do local community-based research, but to see that our research endeavor involves mining the wisdom and the insights from localities and from diverse communities to have a broader shared global understanding that's different, that genuinely is plural. So that's my second thing is whilst honoring partnership close to community, also having a commitment to bring the insights back into global framing, into theoretical debates as well, because that's the way we're going to have a more generalizable understanding that reflects the diversity of circumstances that the populations of concern that we're working with are living in.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for, I think a really wonderful symposium and for sharing what you had to say with us, and also extend that thanks to Sam. Please, Reem, when you let him know that we really appreciated what he brought to it. We're going to finish up here. I think there will be a closing thing on in a few minutes. We'll probably have to go back to the other sort of platform and go to that. And apart from that, I hope everyone continues to enjoy and participate in the conference. And thanks.
Play the part of my favorite play. I feel the art in all these ways. Nobody loves a hidden face, so let it just fade away. Kill this part that stays away. Face those subtle rewards, strike gentle chords. your feet up on my pillow. Let your blood know. Let your blood go. Just hold your breath. Just hold my waist. Just hold my waist. Just hold my waist. It's coming down for me this way. We comfort you and feelings. It's coming from a heated place. This place that means it's something. It's coming down for me this way.